Welcome to the Metamorphosis podcast, where we explore the possibility and processes of personal and community transformation based on the ancient wisdom of Kemet, one of many classical African civilizations, as a foundation. This episode is about creation stories. It is something that is a common topic at the temple and even in my own classroom. So, Baba Derrick, why do you think people of African descent would not want to know their own origin stories?
That's such a deep question you just asked. Do we? How many days do we have for me to answer that question? It's not even hours. I mean, how many days that would take? It's so deep and profound on many levels. But I think, just from a priest's point of view, the biggest and the most damage that's been done to us has been through religion. When you are the creators of religion and spirituality, it's so deeply a part of who you are that no matter where you go in the world, you will find African people belonging to some organization, religious or spiritual organization. In Kemet and in other places that I've studied, there's no such word as atheist. And I've asked other people from the continent, is there a word in their language that translate the atheist? And they said no. Is there a word that translate into agnostic, even in your language? And they said no. One of the elders here, Makaru, who transitioned, Nana Kwame Osewusu, he was Ashanti, and I relied on him a lot to ask questions about the Ashanti. And one of the things he taught me early on that really stuck with me when he said, Baba, I was born Ashanti. I live my life as an Ashanti. And when I transition, I will transition as an Ashanti. That was so powerful to me because what that said to me was the identity and the history of his people is so embedded in him that it didn't matter that he moved to this side of the world, that identity stayed with him. And so when he thinks of an origin story, he thinks of an Ashanti origin story. And that was so powerful to me, Dr. Adams, that I took that lesson he was teaching me and said, that's what's missing in us is our origin story. And it reminds me of a saying, I'm paraphrasing by Cicero, a man who does not want to know what happened before he was born will always remain a child.
It seems to me that this is one of the struggles that I have, even in Black studies versus Africana studies, that people often want to start on that water.
Right.
Like we were born in the middle of the Atlantic.
Absolutely.
And yes, cultures bleed and identities, shift, right? So there was blending there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that those were not 100 distinct cultures that were unrecognizable that became one,
Mm-hmm.
right? That there were some commonalities that made it easier for people to synthesize, but not wanting to begin with freedom. And I know people like Dr. Clark said this, and lots of other people, like everything looks like progress if you were born in the hull of a ship
Right.
or a barracoon,
Right.
and not wanting to know what freedom was like means that we are constantly measuring freedom against only slavery and not a kind of freedom that was self-determining.
And I hate to say this, but sometimes it's because the social structure in this part of the universe is so anti-African that when we try to learn those stories, the people who were teaching it, one, were not given the mic to teach it, and two, were made to seem like they were the devil incarnate. So our people did not grow up around certain people who tried to tell the truth. How many of our people have ever read Barracoon outside of the groups who get together that do that? I lived in the Midwest. I mean, in, well, not Midwest, but Southwest, um, Texas, in a little town called Wichita Falls. I remember in 74 when I got to Wichita Falls and just talking to the black people that lived there, I realized they had a different education than I did. There were things we learned in growing up in Harlem, New York, that I thought was universal, that I thought all black people were learning. But they never heard of Langston Hughes. They never heard of the Harlem Renaissance. They didn't know who W.E.B. Du Bois was. Things that I just assumed people knew, they didn't. And because of that, it began to help me understand how deep it's been in the resistance of telling our story and allowing our people to know what our origin story would have been. That's one thing. But the second thing is more profound. How many of us that stand before the mic talk about ma and pa and sister and brother that we left behind? Even when we pour libation, we don't pour libation to those who cried at our absence, who cried at being snatched away. And because we don't, when we do go back to the continent and someone says, we know who you are, you are an African who are 300 years away from home. It touches us till we cry. Because in that moment, you realize you were not forgotten. And nowhere, and these are adults, right? Some of them 60, 70 years old. For the first time, realizing that you were never forgotten because you were only told the story of you being on the ship and not what you left and who cried for you when you left. That's so important for us because if we understood that part, it's not a deep thought to think about an origin story at that moment.
When do you think, because the people who were on those ships came with origin stories in their heads,
Yes.
when do you think we lost that?
When we stop trying, when we allow the education and the institutions, not just the educational institution, because all the institutions in the United States are anti-African, to teach us who we are. We didn't lose it on the plantation. Let me get that straight. If you understand the narratives, so-called slave narratives, you will see they still recognize their origins. And we did not lose that walking off the plantation. A favorite song that Christians like to sing is "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child." I often ask people, when do you think that song was written? And they don't know. And I said, no problem in you not knowing that. But let me give you a hint. Not a hint, but let me tell you when. 1870. So now you're 5 years off the plantation, right? Sometimes I feel is like a motherless child is the only line in the entire song. A long way from home. What are they singing about? In 1870, 5 years after walking off the plantation, and it was sung by Fisk University Jubilee. Because you didn't know that little piece right there of how that song came into our way of singing it, were they talking about what was happening on the plantation? Or is it possible they were talking about understanding if they were Africans brought here against their will? And that song was a reflection of their thoughts at the time. If you want to understand African genius, if you didn't understand it anyplace else, study the from 1865 to 1915, what our ancestors did in that 50-year period. If you look at what we were capable of doing in that 50-year period of forming families, creating communities, designing educational institutions, businesses, an economic system. If we were as ignorant as people want us to believe, how do you do that in that short period of time? How within 5 years after walking off the plantation, you were building an education institution? Look at some of the dates of these HBCU, and you have to think, wow, that is powerful for a group of people. That means that they did not lose. We have something called cultural continuity at the temple, right? They continued something. And to make your point, it was the commonalities that made them powerful, not the differences. It was those commonalities that they relied on to do the things they were capable of doing once they walk off that plantation. And then after that, we felt there's a book written by Brother William Wadsworth, I think is his name, about philanthropists, money going into the education system of HBCUs and in black schools to determine what kind of education we were going to get. We were getting integrated education prior to 1954. People like to look at 1954 as if we were only getting black studies prior to that. No. That starts in the late 1900s. I mean, 1800s, right? Around 1890, as Dr. Carruthers so brilliantly informed me one day in the conversation when he said to me, go and study the Mohonk Conference of 1890. He said, there were two. And you'll see that they put out a publication to intentionally keep the history away from African people.
This question of creation stories is one that is very common at the temple, common in my own classroom. And certainly there will be ways in which we'll continue to think about these things that Baba Derrick is laying out. I want to add one program note. There's a reference to a book, and I want to give a more full reference. Baba Derrick mentions a book by William H. Watkins, and the title of that book is The White Architects of Black Education, Ideology and Power in America, 1865 to 1954. We want to archive something special that was established in 2000, more than 2 decades ago. We will be uploading episodes on the 14th and the 28th of each month. In upcoming episodes, we will be exploring the history of Christ Universal Temple, its teachings on spirituality and personal growth, and its role in the Columbia, South Carolina community. We invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to receive notifications for future episodes. Thank you for listening.